Welcome everyone, Jente here. In this video, we will continue with the question, what determines the evolutionary success of birds? Now in the previous video, I argued that feathered flight has been an important evolutionary innovation in birds, affecting their consequent evolution. In this video, however, we will focus on another trait, namely beak morphology. There is an amazing diversity in the sizes and shapes of bird beaks, generally related to certain diets. And I will discuss three aspects. First, the genetic basis of this diversity. Second, the effects of diet on other morphological and ecological traits. And finally, other functions of the bird beak. There is more to life than just diet. But let's start with the genetic basis. A good strategy to unravel the genetic underpinnings of a trait is by comparing closely related species with different morphologies. And a good place to find these study systems is oceanic islands. On the Hawaiian Islands, for example, there is an impressive radiation of honeycreepers, evolved from a single ancestor, giving rise to a variety of beak shapes, as you can see here. But one of the best studied island radiations is the Darwin's finches. A few million years ago, a South American finch reached the Galapagos Islands and diversified into the species we see today, each adapted to a different food source. Species with a big beak can crack hard nuts, while pointed-beaked ones can feed on insects. Recently, evolutionary biologists took a closer look at the genetics of these finches. They compared the genomes of birds with different beak morphologies. For example, the blunt beak of the large ground finch and the sharp beak of the sharp-beaked ground finch. And they uncovered some genomic regions that are significantly different between the species. In the figure below, you can see several genomic outliers and the genes associated with them. Further analyses showed that different genes affect different aspects of the beak morphology, such as the width, the depth, and the size. Case closed. Did we find the genetic basis of beak morphology? Well, not so fast. A similar study on great tits found different genes under selection. It seems that beak morphology is determined by different genes in different species. So what's going on here? Well, a recent paper in the journal Genome Research provided a possible solution to this mystery. Instead of looking at the protein coding genes, the researchers focused on the genetic on and off switches that regulate gene expression. And they found several genetic pathways underlying the development of bird beaks in the embryo. Several of these pathways are depicted in the figure on the right. Please don't focus on the details, but notice that by slightly tweaking certain sections of these pathways, you can adjust the expression of particular genes and regulate the development of the beak. The rationale behind this finding is nicely captured by a quote from evolutionary biologist Niels Shubin. Living things do not inherit skulls, backbones, or cell layers from their ancestors. They inherit the processes that build them. Now, the flexible genetic basis of bird morphology or beak morphology explains the diversity that we see today. But how does diet affect the morphology of the beak and other traits? Let's have a look at a few examples. First, falcons. These birds are predators and use a structure in their beak, a so-called falcon tooth, to kill their prey. You can nicely see one in this peregrine falcon. Eagles, on the other hand, and also other birds of prey, do not have this tooth, and they use their massive claws to kill their prey, as you can see here. Another group of birds of prey, vultures, do not kill their prey, but feed on carcasses. Sticking your head into a dead body can be messy, and that is why these birds have evolved naked necks so they can enter the carcasses without making too much of a mess. And then there's woodpeckers. These birds use their long pointed beaks to hammer against trees and retrieve insects from crevices. This lifestyle is also reflected in other traits. They have zygodactyl feet, so 2 toes pointed forward and 2 backward, allowing them to climb tree trunks, and their stiff tail provides the necessary balance. Finally, their long tongue, which is wrapped around their skull, helps them to extract insects from the holes that they are drilling. And then a special species, the huatzin. we still don't know a lot about this species. For example, its exact evolutionary position in the evolutionary tree. They are also known as stingbirds because they smell like cow manure. And that is logical because this species is a herbivore and they ferment their food in an enlarged crop, very similar to mammalian ruminants. Now, all these different traits ensure that species adapt to certain ecological niches. In this figure, you can see 3 North American warblers that use different parts of a tree. Because each species is foraging in its own ecological niche, there is little competition and the birds can coexist. Now, this concept of ecological coexistence is also visible among shorebirds. Notice how each species has a different bill morphology. The spoon-billed sandpiper has a small spoon at the end of its bill. The curlew sandpiper has a beak that curves downwards, while the beak of the avocet curves upwards. And the marsh sandpiper has a long, pointed beak. So each species is adapted to a certain type of food, allowing them to forage side by side. So there is clearly a link between diet and beak morphology. But beaks can also serve other functions. For example, thermoregulation. A recent study in the Journal of Avian Biology showed how the ground hornbill uses its beak to regulate its body temperature. The graph you see here indicates that air temperature on the x-axis increases, then the temperature of the beak on the y-axis also increases. So the bird uses its beak to dissipate excessive heat and cool down. The shape of the beak also determines the sounds that a bird can produce. Here you see the skulls of several South American wood creepers. The sonograms on the right show that species with a short beak, so the ones on top, produce very fast songs with many short notes. This is not possible for species with a long beak, which you see at the bottom of the figure. They produce slower songs with very long stretched notes. Now, beaks can also be used for non-vocal communication. The beak of the puffin, for example, reflects UV light. We as humans cannot see this, but the birds can. And perhaps they use this to attract females. Now, the exact function is still a matter of debate. And finally, birds can use their beaks to manipulate tools. Here you see a New Caledonian crow that is using a stick to extract food from a hole. Very ingenious. So this short overview of beak morphology only scratches the surface. I hope that this video convinced you that the flexible genetic basis of beak morphology results in a wide variety of shapes and sizes, providing numerous ecological and evolutionary possibilities.